All right, we are back here on the Just End the Suffering podcast. Getting ready, hockey season starting up in the next couple of weeks here. I wanted to get this in before all the baseball playoff craziness starts here. Join me today to get us ready for the hockey season from a local perspective, the host of the Sports in the Waiting Room podcast, Christopher, not the Mad Dog Russo. Chris, how are you?
I am great, Mike. It's a cold, rainy day, and a cold, rainy week, but honestly, just being able to talk about the frozen violence that is the National Hockey League really is uplifting my spirits.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely great. And I got to say here, I mean, there was the offseason in general. I mean, this player movement and all over the place is crazy. The Rangers made some moves. A lot of guys went to new markets. They had the whole saga with Johnny Gaudreau changing teams, the Flames making big moves to replace him. I feel like there was a lot of crazy stuff happening this offseason.
Yeah, what I like about this offseason actually is I think there should be a lot more parity in the league this year. I think Ottawa got better. I think Columbus obviously got better. I think the Devils got a little better. Obviously, they're really progressing. That's just for the Eastern Conference. And then, you look at a few teams in the Western Conference as well. Edmonton is still going to be scary. I think there are honestly maybe 4 or 5 teams that could hoist the Stanley Cup. And I will also say it's interesting to see, it's going to be interesting, especially to see what happens at both ends of the Tkachuk deal, the Calgary, Florida deal, because a lot of good guys went Calgary's way as well. And I don't know if they're going to be more top heavy, but they're going to be deeper.
Yeah, that trade's really fascinating here. And start with the Rangers here. So for people who've been living under a rock, are not the biggest hardcore hockey fans, hockey observers, as they will, give us the general summary what the Rangers have doing this offseason.
Okay, so I think first off, they were right on not bringing back Ryan Strome because he just missed too many big opportunities. He did a lot of great things for the team, but he really did just miss too many huge opportunities, particularly, I think the first one you probably think of is Game 5 against Tampa, which was, or probably maybe the biggest turning point, actually, considering they still had home ice up until then. But I would say you figured they were going to sign Kopp or Vetrano. They were going to sign one of those guys. They brought back neither. Now, the upside for them is that Vetrano went to Anaheim. He went to the Western Conference and not even a real big contender in the Western Conference. And Kopp went to, he's still within the division. I believe Detroit, right? I think Detroit's still in the division. Regardless, he's still in the Eastern Conference, but Kopp at least didn't go, if you're a Rangers fan, to Devils, Isles, Flyers, Pens, Bruins, maybe Washington. He went to Detroit, and he's also from Michigan. So that's, at least you can at least say that. But Vinny Trocheck was a huge signing. He's a guy who's very experienced. He's a great two-way forward. And honestly, they can replace those two losses, the Kopp-Vetrano losses, with Brennan Hoffman, who looks great in the minors. And then apparently they've mended fences with Vitaly Kravtsov. Apparently he wants to be back at the Garden. So he's obviously a guy with a lot of talent. They should be fine there in terms of forwards. I will say, I don't think they gave Nils Lundkvist a fair shake. I don't think they gave him enough of an opportunity. I thought he was a very good defenseman. I thought he definitely deserved more of an opportunity, obviously, than Patrick Nemeth. By the way, that's the best thing they probably did this offseason was let Patrick Nemeth go, because he was, I think their biggest liability the entire season. And, he had his bright moments, but I think that was a great move for them. But I will say, despite letting go of Lundkvist, I think they got a pretty good return for him, considering how little they actually saw of him. And I will also say they got a good return for Alexander Georgiev, a guy who is, I think, better than some Ranger fans claim. I've got a lot of friends who are Ranger fans who have been very critical of Georgiev, but he is a guy who, look, he had to play in the shadow of Igor Shesterkin, who is, if not the best, then at least the second best goaltender in the world right now, maybe behind Vasilevsky, if anything. And won the Vezina last year, had an incredible year. Georgiev could be a starter for most of the teams in the NHL, and that's obviously why the Colorado Avalanche have picked him probably to be their next starter just after winning the Stanley Cup. But I think they've also deepened their goaltending when you look at a couple of moves they made, including Louis Domingue, and they should be fine. They should be probably about as good a team this year, maybe a little better.
Let's go in on some of these things here, starting with Vinny Trocheck being the 2C, and that spot's in a revolving door for them for years, trying to figure out what they want to do with it. We have the rumors about the trade for Eichel up through last year before he got moved to Vegas. They signed Zibanejad long-term. It always be Strome. They trade for Kopp. They end up keeping neither. They bring Trocheck in instead of promoting Philip Heel internally, going somewhere else. So what do you think Trocheck does to this team?
the most important thing I'd say is win faceoffs, because the Rangers for years, that has been their bugaboo. I mean, they struggled on the power play for a long time, but they've always had, I would say, for as long as I've watched hockey, they have had great goaltending. Clearly, they've had Henrik Lundqvist, who I could argue is Mount Rushmore of goaltenders. You have Igor Shesterkin, who's one of the best goaltenders in the world right now. They've always had solid defense, usually pretty strong coaching, and fairly young, good defensive team. Their PK is usually pretty good. The power play has struggled. It's generally been the power play and faceoffs. For years, faceoffs have killed them. That's been a big issue. So to have Vincent Trocheck there, and not only have him win draws, but have him win draws on the second line, because usually they have maybe like third, fourth line guys, or their big draw guys couldn't really do it as much on the top line. So that's huge. But he's a great two-way forward. He plays well at both ends of the ice, and he has an opportunity. I think he's a much better offensive forward than I think his stats might even imply, because he was in Florida and then he was in Carolina, which is a great system, but it's honestly more like Carolina almost seems like the old Devils, or maybe the Islanders now, where it's a great defensive system, but it might be more restrictive of players. And so I think especially with guys like Panarin and Zibanejad, guys like Adam Fox, Trocheck will have the ability to be more creative considering his personnel.
Yeah, certainly interesting to see here as well. Honestly, the big highlights from last year was Chris Kreider obliterating his career high in goals. It was 52, never had 28 in a season before last year. So obviously, you expect some sort of regression here. He's not going to do 52 again. Like, what do you think is a realistic target for the Rangers to hope for? Is it 40 goals? Is it 35? Like, what do you think they're looking for here out of Kreider?
Well, look, ideally, if you're the Rangers, he scores 92. Yeah. But I would say, he ties Gretzky. But I would say a realistic goal, 30 to 35. That's pretty fair, because I think he's been rather consistent. He's still been a great player, even before the 52 goal season, even though he hasn't scored 28 yet, he had still been a great player for the Rangers. He is becoming one of their all-time great players, one of their longest tenured players, and he's incredible in the postseason. He's one of the most clutch postseason players in the history of the organization. But I think he at least set the bar a little higher last year for future endeavors. So I think he should end up with 30 to 35 goals for next year, and maybe for the next few years. He's really been rather consistent. He's a much better overall player, I think, when he wants to be. He kind of turns his hockey IQ on and off, and I've talked to hockey people about this. But he is a very good two-way player, honestly, and he's not a bad passer either when he's just with the right people. He is a more complete player. So 30 to 35 goals, I think, is a fair target.
Yeah, it's fair. And speaking of the other guy who had the unworld of the year last year, Igor Shesterkin, the goaltender here, I mean, he played his 53 games, but when he was on, he was incredible. I mean, like, he stole a bunch of games to the Rangers last year. He did have some help from Georgiev carrying him when he was hurt for a little bit. I mean, obviously, the Rangers need to be as close to that version as possible, maybe even pick up a few more games, because now their back goes from Georgiev to Yaroslav Halak. So what do you think they expect out of Shesterkin this year?
Well, again, I think it might be fair to argue that was his peak. For 1 year, that would be his best year for his career, even though he's very, very young. But I mean, it's not necessarily fair again to compare him to Lundqvist, but I will say Lundqvist somehow took 7 years to win his only Vezina title, while Shesterkin took 3, I believe. Yeah, with an even stronger season than Lundqvist's Vezina season. And like Lundqvist in 2012, he was a finalist for the Hart Trophy. He honestly could have won, although I think I might have given it to McDavid, but either McDavid or Matthews is obviously a great choice. He should still probably be the favorite, I think, to win the Vezina, and it should be interesting to see what he does, most importantly, with probably a better team in front of him.
Yeah, that's for sure here. Let's also go ahead to next up here. We're going to go to the young guys here, because there's a lot of young guys in this team here. Obviously, the kid line's a big deal in the playoffs with Lafreniere, Kakko, and Heel playing together. Kravtsov is back. They have a lot of young defense in here. As much as we're saying, some of these veterans could step back, I think that could be offset by some of the progression from the younger players. What do you think about that?
yeah, in particular, this should be the year for Lafreniere, Capo Caco, and Philip Hedel, three guys who, like, they would not have been as far as they had gotten. They would not have gotten to play Tampa and forced a Game 6 in the Eastern Conference Final if not for those three guys. They wouldn't have knocked off Pittsburgh, come back to win that series. They wouldn't have upset Carolina. Those three guys were, I don't know if I would say they were the best line in terms of scoring in that postseason, but they were probably the most consistent line. And I will say that was it game 1, I think? There's a score run. There was a goal. I think Hedel sets up in front for a one-timer. I think maybe was the best shift they had all season. Those three guys, if you're Gerard Gallant, you have to keep those guys together and expect big things this year. I'm not saying, they're all going to score 100 points, but I think 60 for each of those guys. I'd say 180 points at least between the three of those guys is a reasonable target. I could honestly see it. I will also say Alexis Lafreniere is a much better defensive forward than people realize. He gets back. He's a good defensive forward. And then, Fox still needs to, Fox obviously regressed a little bit last year because Cale Makar had a big year. And Zach Jones is a guy who is finally going to receive more responsibility, I believe. So that defensive core should be big. And Keandre Miller continues to make huge strides to the point where I think he could be a Norris candidate at some point.
Yeah, it's very exciting to see this young group come together here. And obviously, they made a big run last year. They went all the way to the conference final, lost to the Lightning, and the rest of the league conference is still strong in there. I mean, Carolina is great. Florida made some moves. Tampa's still the reigning conference champions here. Like, what do you think is a realistic year for this Rangers team here? Is like, do you think this is one of the things, maybe they take a step back or take 2 steps forward next year in the Cup Final, and then they can build off of last year?
I honestly think they could be playing in the Stanley Cup Final this year. Because, I genuinely think, I know they went out and got Burns and Pacioretty, but I think the Hurricanes got worse. They replaced half their defensive core, and I know D'Angelo was very inconsistent, especially in that Rangers series, but also just immature in that postseason. But I genuinely think, the Hurricanes also lost guys like Brendan Smith, went to the Devils. I think they actually got worse. I swear. I think that series, the Hurricanes were not really what I thought they were, because I thought they were going to take out the Rangers maybe in 7 games, probably a little more easily at least than 7 games. I did not think, I think once game 3 rolled around, I think we realized Carolina was not really who they thought that we were. I will say that I think the Hurricanes got worse. I think the Penguins only got older. I was surprised because for the last 5 years they've been complacent. They've just held on to all those guys and they haven't gotten out of the first round since 2018. So they've really just kind of been stuck in the mud. And now it's just the point where those guys, I think, are just going to try to stick around to the end of their career. I would say the Flyers are still got awful. The Devils got better. Ottawa got better. Columbus got better. And Florida got a little better, but Florida, again, was also, if you're a Panthers fan, very disappointing, where they narrowly escaped Washington after that Game 5, and then they just got picked apart by Tampa Bay. And even then, Tampa Bay lost Andre Palat, and that's a guy they can only do so much to replace as opposed to the other guys they replaced, like Yanni Gourde and Blake Coleman. So I don't think any of those teams that got better really got to the Rangers level. And remember, the Rangers had Tampa Bay on the ropes last year. They did. If they scored one more goal in Game 3, and this series is gone. And I think there was a questionable, like Game 5, I think Rangers-Tampa was one of the worst officiated games, I think, favoring Tampa I've ever seen. So I think, I genuinely think they could be playing in the Stanley Cup Final this year.
Yeah, that's for sure. Let's go to a team we thought was going to be contending for the Stanley Cup Final last year, which is the Islanders. And obviously, they sort of had a crazy off-season going on here with all this stuff. And then everything sort of went off on the rails. They had the COVID outbreak early. They had the long road trip. Things fell apart here. What did they do this offseason sort of change the mix-up here?
There wasn't a lot of change, I would say, within the roster itself. Of course, Zdeno Chara retiring, it's not necessarily the biggest killer hockey-wise, considering he's in his 24th season, but he's a solid defensive defenseman, even at the end of his career, and was a big locker room presence. So he was the one guy he was one of the few guys who had really had deep postseason runs, gone to the final. on this team. Obviously, they made the conference final each of the last 2 years before that. The Islanders also, they picked up Alexander Romanov. I don't know what to say really about that deal. I think the jury's still out on that one. His stats aren't incredible, and they might have given up maybe a little too much for him. But the most important thing really was the Barry Trotz firing. I thought that was a terrible decision. And Lou Lamoriello might be the best for his career, might be the best active general manager and one of the best ever. I think he's done a great job with the Islanders in building this organization. Obviously, he did an incredible job with the Devils, and he's built this team into a great system. But I really do not understand the Trotz firing. I honestly equate it with the Bruins firing Bruce Cassidy, where there was just nothing wrong there. It had nothing to do with Trotz. I think it was the fact that the team had to play hurt. The team, so many guys had COVID, and then they played so long on the road because they were still constructing UBS. So, not the best offseason for the Islanders, I don't think. And the Trotz firing in particular is a big problem.
Yeah, I didn't get that when I saw they did it, because I'm like, yeah, I get that, Barry Trotz usually has a short shelf life with some of these teams, but like you can say like the first couple of years he was there, they were great, and they were like literally like a game away from the Stanley Cup Final twice, and then last year sort of goes out of control. It's always felt like Lou Lamoriello sort of throwing him overboard, saying, like, I don't like where this ship is going here. I'm going to get him out 1 year too early instead of 1 year too late.
Yeah, I think you can argue now, honestly, especially because Arbor was there for so long, I think you could honestly argue now that Barry Trotz is the second best coach in the history of the New York Islanders behind Al Arbor, who led that team to 4 Stanley Cup titles, led them to the Cup Final 5 times. I think was still there when they went to the conference final in '93 and upset Pittsburgh after they had won back-to-back years. So, Jack Capilano was great, but I genuinely think Barry Trotz might be the best coach they have had since Al Arbor left the organization. To get to the conference final twice is just impressive for any team, but for an Islander team that had not really gotten near that level of their early 80s teams since 93. I think it's terribly unfair to him. The team is well built. They have a great system. Again, the Islanders are kind of like Carolina. They are built kind of like the old Devils. And even 2 years ago, they had adapted. They got back to the conference final without Robin Leonard, who had won the Vezina, I believe. So, so clearly it wasn't just Robin Leonard. It was the system. The system for the Islanders worked. And I don't think, I think the reason they were the best team that did not make the playoffs last year, at least within the Eastern Conference. So, biggest issue was half their team got COVID. They had to push back all these games, and they had to play, I'm pretty sure it was their first 13 games on the road because of the construction building UBS. I don't think they started at UBS until November. So I really don't get it. You should not expect anyone else to lead this team right now.
Yeah, that's for sure here. I mean, last year, obviously, was such a disaster year for them, but, a lot of the roster, I think, is still the same. They haven't done too much to tweak things here. Do you think last year was the fluke and that they're going to be bouncing back right in the mix again for a deep playoff run? You think last year's a sign that, this is on the way down now, and that's why Lou sort of acted proactively and got rid of Trotz?
Well, I think it was, in some ways, it was a sign to come, considering the Islanders are one of the oldest teams in the league. It's considering the age of the average Islander player, I think it could be a sign to come, but I think it was also a fluke just because, again, they reached the conference final the last 2 years. I don't think you regress that quickly in a normal year. You'd probably get to the second round, get knocked out in the first round, whatever. But missing the playoffs is something pretty rare after 2 seasons of such success. And again, half their team got COVID. They had to play so long. They probably had to play probably about a month or so on the road before having to play at UBS. So it was an abnormal season in general for them. Very, very difficult, especially, you think about it, those 2 teams that reached the conference final. 2020, they were in the bubble. And 2021, it was still a kind of limited in terms of crowds. And it was weird because, it was also different with the Canadian system and, how the divisions work in the playoffs. So generally, yes, I think it was a fluke. And I think I don't know if they'll be in the conference final this year, but I think they'll be back in the playoffs.
Yeah, let's go to the other team that's not been in the playoffs a little bit here is the Devils. And they were pretty busy this offseason. You want to give everybody sort of a quick wrap up here what the Devils were doing?
Yeah, so big move obviously is they make a move in signing an experienced, versatile, goal-scoring leader in Andre Palat, a guy who's won 2 Stanley Cup titles, been to the final 3 straight years. He's been to the Cup Final 4 times. He was there with Tampa in 2015. He's been a career member of the Lightning, and that is, I think, ultimately a great move in that the Devils have never really been, up until that ridiculous Kovalchuk contract. The Devils have never really been a big spending team. They've really built through the draft, but they have, I would say, they at least deepen their goaltending. I don't know if their goaltending got better. I think Blackwood is probably still the guy out of the 3 on that roster, but they at least deepen their goaltending by signing Vitek Vanacek. And they also saw, I think this is an underrated signing. They bring in Brendan Smith to ensure the back end. He's a good defensive defenseman. We saw him with the Rangers. We saw him with Carolina. We saw him with Detroit. And he's also, remember, I think when Tom Wilson got the quote-unquote maximum in terms of that fine, that Brendan Smith was the only guy, because they didn't really have a fighter. They didn't have Reeves at that point. Brendan Smith was the only guy who really could, let alone did, stand up to Wilson after that one. So he's a guy who is very, very good for that organization. And frankly, they also, look, I've had friends who are Devil fans who just have called out Ty Smith often, time and time again. And so I've heard they really stole John Marino from Pittsburgh for him and get rid of Ty Smith. They lose PK Subban to retirement, but he wasn't, frankly, that much of a factor in the last couple of years. So overall, I think they got better. Honestly, I think they're a much better offensive team than they ever were when they were winning the Cup.
Yeah, I think they're an interesting spot compared to like the rest of the division here, because obviously, I mean, you have the Rangers and Carolina up on top of the division here. Columbus made the big moves here. They land Johnny Gaudreau, which nobody's expecting to have happen here. I mean, the Penguins sort of maintain status quo. They're kind of slipping the end of last year. Same for Washington. The Devils are kind of that spot where, like, is this the year where they take that big leap forward here? They've been trying to add big splashes, whether it was Palat this year, Dougie Hamilton last year, try and add some veteran leadership to that very talented young group. It's had a lot of high lottery picks. So, like, you think this is the year that the Devils are pushing for, like, a wild card spot?
Yeah, they should be pushing for a wild card spot. I don't know if they'll make the playoffs this year, but it should be a year where they look, I think, even better than they did last year. I think they actually looked fairly good last year. They knocked off some of the best teams. I mean, they got into just trap meets with, they beat Colorado and Edmonton. They won some big games, so they can beat some of the bigger teams. It just needs to be more consistent, and they need to have better defense and better goaltending. Now, look, I think I read the Hockey News had their preview for the Metropolitan Division, and for some reason they picked the Devils to finish last, and I was very surprised at that, especially because I think the Flyers should be worse, and I think the Flyers organizationally just look way worse, honestly. Especially with what they did with Yandel, it just looks like a more downtrodden organization. The Devils, I think, have picked up a lot more. And then you have the possibility, I know I said the Islanders should make the playoffs, but there's the possibility of an Islander downturn. And again, Pittsburgh has been complacent over the last 5 years. Columbus is still kind of up and coming. They're kind of in the same place the Devils are. It really is going to depend on health and goaltending for New Jersey. Goaltending is going to be the biggest part. If they can get better on the back end, they will be a good team, and they will at least be in contention for the playoffs.
Yeah, for sure. So it's a year for the local front here, but obviously on a big picture scale here, like the season's starting about a week to 10 days away. We got a little bit more preseason to go through here. Like, as of day of recording here, like, who would be your picks to make the Stanley Cup Finals?
You know what? I actually think the Rangers are going to play in the final this year. I do think they're going to be there because I think this is they came very close to overtaking Tampa. I think they kind of I think they expanded their window a little bit on the front end. I think they expanded their championship window on the front end, where people thought maybe it would take another year or two before they would really compete. And I was thinking they could play in the conference final. I had said that last year. So I think Tampa, obviously you lose Palat, it's very tough to replace him, and they can only, with any budget, you can only hold on to that core for so long. So I think the Rangers will actually play in the final this year. That's my pick. I would say in the Western Conference, I think Colorado is going to repeat. I think I think the Eastern Conference is much more loaded than the Western Conference. I'll say that again. It's probably up to Colorado and Edmonton. We'll see about Calgary. I don't know. I mean, we'll figure it out. And I will say, not to say that they're even going to be even a playoff contender, but I think Anaheim honestly got a lot better. I just want to point that out. But yeah, I think it's probably going to be Colorado again. I think Colorado's going to win the whole thing again. I know they lost Nazem Kadri and they changed goaltenders, but again, Georgiev is a capable goaltender who can prove himself. And I don't think any team, including Edmonton, Tampa Bay, or the Rangers, really got to their level during the offseason, even though they maybe got a little worse.
Yeah, I mean, technically, I'm looking at this right now. The regular season technically starts on Friday in Prague with the Global Series with San Jose and Nashville, which is a interesting choice by the NHL. But you're looking stateside here. The opening night doubleheader on Tuesday the 11th here. You got the Lightning coming to Tampa Bay, Lightning coming to New York, take on the Rangers here, and then the Golden Knights taking on the Kings. So, interesting start to the season for sure.
Yeah, it's going to be intense. It should be a fun year.
Absolutely, Chris. Thanks all the time. Really appreciate it. Before I let you go, I'll be a follow social media. Keep up with your podcast.
Yeah, so I am. The podcast is Sports in the Waiting Room, and that's the title. Pretty much started because of this, height of the pandemic, and I'll talk about sports for about an hour or so. It depends on the week. 45 minutes to an hour, could go over depending on the week. We release it on Wednesdays. You can find it on just wherever you get your podcasts, and you can look at my Twitter at Chris Russo 98, CHRISRUSSO 98, and that's where you can get links to it if you really want. It was not on last week, but honestly, just because I've been getting over, we've all been kind of a little bit sick, so just getting back from that. But should have one up tomorrow, hopefully. So, or as we record this tomorrow, we're recording this on Tuesday, so should have it up for Wednesday the 5th. The next episode. So, yeah, appreciate it, Mike.
Yes, so this episode will be out the 5th as well. So it should be out. His new episode will be out at the same time as this one is. So if you're done listening to this one, check out Chris's new episode of the podcast. Chris, thanks for all the time. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, Mike, thank you so much.